Hello, y'all, and welcome back. We are examining Anselm's ontological argument for God's existence. In the previous video, we began our argument rather, by defining the terms possible, contingent, and necessary, three terms in modal logic, the logic of necessity and possibility. They're going to be very important for understanding this argument. The term we're going to examine in this video is God. Now, God we will define as a perfect being, and God has historically and traditionally been defined as perfect inasmuch as he possesses the three perfections of being. He is omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, and morally perfect, not doing and in fact incapable of doing anything morally wrong. Now, despite the fact that the ontological argument is controversial for a number of reasons, this is, in my experience, I've been teaching it for about 15 years, by far the place where most people get stuck, where most of the objections arise. And I've presented it to lots of different kinds of audiences. And the objections are two. First, the objection is, well, how could you possibly claim to define something as vast and unknowable as God? It's just by definition, or just the very concept of God is something totally beyond our grasp. So to capture it in some neat little definition is just hopelessly impossible. The other and perhaps more common objection is there are so many different conceptions of God. There are millions, millions and millions of conceptions of God. So if you define God, you're only defining your God or some one particular sort of subjectively selected God, and you're leaving all the other ones untouched. So your argument's only really valid for your God. So it's just kind of too subjective. And I think these are good and interesting objections, but I also think that they are relatively easily met. So I want to take some time in this video and entertain these two objections. Let's start with the first one, the idea that you couldn't possibly define something as vast as God. So as Aristotle reminds us, a definition is a linguistic formula capturing a thing's essence, capturing what that thing is at its core. That's to say, what distinguishes it from all other things. A definition is not and never was intended to capture absolutely everything about that thing. So you can define a term, you can single out something with a definition without coming even close to fully capturing everything in linguistic formula about what it is, or even understanding it. A good example of this is very large numbers. So on social media just this morning, I saw somebody say that Apple has a market share of $3 trillion. And we hear, figures like this for big corporations like Apple and Amazon all the time. Now, nobody, I should think, can fully grasp the concept of a trillion, at least not in a way that would mentally distinguish it from the concept of, say, a billion. And again, if somebody claims to be able to do this, I would say, I would question their ability to do this. I don't think anybody can do this. But it doesn't keep us from using these terms all the time. I mean, not constantly, maybe not every day, but regularly, right? We use these terms in meaningful ways because we can use terms, we can employ terms and even define them without fully grasping them or even coming close to fully grasping them. Same here too with God. God is, of course, vast. In some senses, God is indeed infinite, but we don't need to fully grasp God in order to define God, to specify what we're talking about when we talk about God in a way necessary for the purposes of, say, an argument like this. What about the second objection, that any conception of God is going to be hopelessly subjective? Now, here I will use an example from presidential politics. So we define God as a perfect being. Okay, he is omniscient, omnipotent, and morally perfect. So we're talking about the existence of such a being, and we're talking about some certain minimal criteria that something must meet in order to qualify as a being like this. But we're not saying anything else about the nature of this being. We're not saying who this being's favorite prophet is, favorite holy book, means of praying, whether this being is singular or triune or more than three persons. In other words, all these kind of religious specifics are completely untouched. The God we're talking about here is a metaphysical posit that is intentionally very, very minimal, right? So we say a few things about it, but it's very minimal. And the example from presidential politics would go as follows. The United States has a president, the highest executive office in the land. Now, there is, as it so happens, in America, a certain amount of disagreement about who the president is. Supporters of Donald Trump will refer to him as my president, not meaning that like I like the idea of him being president, but they will say the past election was rigged, it was unfair, he still is the legitimate president. Others will disagree and say that he is in fact not the president. But all of them agree, every party to this discussion agrees that the United States has a president, and they'll agree that the president is the highest executive office in the land, the commander-in-chief, and so on and so forth. That's what we're doing here. We're talking about, is there a God? In other words, is there a president? And certain minimal conditions something must meet to be that thing, without saying anything about who exactly this God is, who exactly the president is, right? So we're asking the question, right, does such a being exist? We're working with this kind of overwhelmingly common traditional conception of God as a perfect being. What we're doing here is focusing on what is overwhelmingly the most common referent of the term God, this perfect being believed in by all the major monotheistic religions of the world, but also the term that is used by atheists when they say, I don't believe in God, most of the time. They're not saying I don't believe in Zeus or Hera. Obviously, they also just believe in those gods, but they're referring in conversation with theists to this traditional God, this perfect being. And of course, it's worth noting that people who believe in some other kind of God, if you ask them, well, do you believe in a perfect being? They'll say no. So in that sense, they are an atheist. There's some form of atheist, at least. So we have God as a perfect being. Now, if we stop with just God as a perfect being, possessing the perfections of omniscience, omnipotence, and moral perfection, we do not yet have God. This is important to note. And the reason is, both believers in God who say I do believe in God and atheists who say I don't believe in God, when they refer to God, they mean a being that is in fact perfect. So not just possessing the perfections of being, but possessing them in the most perfect possible way. Here's what I mean by that. So when someone says God is omnipotent, all-powerful, they don't mean God is all-powerful but used to be weak. And someone says God is omniscient, all-knowing, they don't mean God is all-knowing but might have been uninformed, could possibly have been uninformed. They don't mean by saying God is morally perfect that God is morally perfect now, but developed this moral perfection out of a previous state of moral imperfection. They mean a being that has those properties and could not have been otherwise. In other words, possesses these properties necessarily. So possesses the perfections of being in the most perfect possible way. Again, there may be somebody who believes in a God that possesses these perfections but didn't used to, perhaps evolved to be all-powerful or all-knowing. And again, it's worth talking to those people, engaging the grounds for arguments and evidence for believing in that God, but that is not a perfect being. The perfect being that is referred to by theists and atheists alike in conversations about God is a being that possesses the perfections of being and could not have been otherwise. In other words, possesses the perfections of being necessarily in the most perfect possible way. So, God is necessarily omniscient, omnipotent, and morally perfect. This is the working definition of God, and I've kind of defended this definition of God, that we will use going forward as we look in the next video at the actual argument. I'll see you then.